Welcome to Communicating Cyber, the series where cybersecurity leaders go beyond the jargon to share stories, strategies, and real-world lessons that earn trust and gain buy-in for your program. I'm Robin Oldham, founder of Cydia, and I've spent 2 decades helping organizations defend themselves against cybercrime and thrive in a digital world. From advising boards during crises to shaping long-term strategy, I've seen just how powerful the right conversation can be. In each episode, we explore how CISOs and cyber leaders tackle one of the industry's biggest challenges: communicating complexity in a way that's clear, compelling, and connects with people. This is your space to learn, share, and be inspired by your peers. Today, we're joined by Larry Tompkins, a seasoned technology leader with over 20 years of experience driving digital transformation across a variety of industries. Known for translating complex tech into business impact, Larry has led major change programs, advised boards, and delivered IT strategies that stick. To kick things off, Larry, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. So what's your career journey been like, and how have you ended up as the kind of IT information systems director that you are today?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. I've been doing this for about 20 years, or just over 20 years now. Over the course of my career, I've seen sort of every side of the industry, if you see what I mean. So I've worked for consulting companies, I've worked for software vendors, I've worked for small businesses, large businesses, as well as when I was consulting, what we call client side roles as well, sort of where I am today at Aspen. I've worked across
all variety then of loads of different.
Absolutely, yeah. Lots of different sectors as well, from sort of food and beverage. So I worked for Brakes Brothers, who are a large food wholesaler. I've worked for Vodafone, so various industries, sectors, local government, central government, utilities. So I've got quite a big view, a big world view, if you like, is sort of what I would consider. I always set out to have a foot in both the IT and the business camp. So I've never done coding, for example. I'm not sort of that sort of pure techie side of things. But I've always sort of looked to ensure that whatever we deliver from an IT perspective has real business value. So for example, just very briefly, way back where it started, my degree, I specifically did a degree that was half IT and half business to get a proper understanding of the business challenges. So I wasn't coming everything from a pure technology side. It was a case of understanding where the value is to the business. So we weren't building systems for having flashing lights on the wall's sake. It was all about how we delivered value into the business.
How you solve a business challenge, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the biggest thing is understanding what that challenge is first. When I worked for a consulting business, I worked for Capgemini, our focus was always on let's solve the problem rather than let's repeat what we've done on a bunch of other projects before. And I know some other organizations sort of take that view. It was very much a case of understanding the problem and then building the solution based on that. And that's something that I've tried to sort of continue through with my career.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so, as you say, very varied career, lots of different sizes of organizations, sectors, roles and responsibilities, both in-house and as an advisor and things. Is there a particular time that you can kind of think back to where you had to maybe explain a really kind of tricky or complex or kind of technical kind of cyber risk to a really non-technical board or leadership team? Is there something that sticks in your mind there that you
I think I've had my role here has sort of fully encompassed the cyber risk role, but it's probably the first time in my career I've had that full accountability for cyber. So to be honest, probably not specifically a cyber risk, but over my career where we're implementing technology solutions, you normally you get in that situation where how do I deliver this complex technology to a non-technical audience? And I think cyber risk is just sort of, it's that with bells on, if you like. There's always a level of complexity above. But for me, as I said, I go back to sort of my roots, if you like, and saying, okay, what's the business challenge? What's the impact this risk or this situation is going to have on the business? Put that into a context that the audience will understand, and then sort of slowly ratchet up the level of technology that you, or the level of technical information that you need to deliver. And I think the main thing for me is you need to make sure that you understand your audience, and you don't go down any rabbit holes that you don't want to go down, because if you open the lid on something too technical, too much detail, then you can sort of get yourself, you just end up concerning and worrying your audience. So I think it sort of starts simple and build up from there. and constantly check that they're with you, they're staying with you, they're following it, and sort of restate the impact on the business,
Yeah.
both
Yeah.
positive or negative.
And I suppose that building up, kind of going from something simple to more complex, that isn't necessarily something that you would expect to do in one particular session, right? I think
No.
knowing some of how you've approached some of these things, I know it's not all kind of, but for folks listening and kind of watching along,
Yeah.
that isn't just a one and done, right?
No, absolutely, and I think that's really important. That you have to establish the basics, you have to establish the principles where you're coming from, and then you can start to talk in more detail. And some of these things as well, particularly actually with cyber risk, you can highlight what is a perceived risk. And then as you start to work through that, you will either uncover more or less risk. Do you see what I mean? You sort of understand, in some cases, it turns out actually this is worse than we thought, and there's now this over here. Particularly where we are at Aspen, we're a highly acquisitive business. So one of our biggest challenges, one of our biggest risks actually, is the M&A activity. So we target 5, 6, 7 businesses a year that we attempt to bring in. And whilst we won't necessarily fully integrate those businesses from the word go, and we will sort of slowly build that up as well, from day one, the minute we own that business, we're on the hook for the cyber risk, right? So if we've bought a business in the UK and Europe, the GDPR exposure immediately is a group-wide exposure. So, in fact, actually, that's sort of brought me full circle back to your question. So, in terms of one of the biggest things I think that I had a communication with when I first joined Aspen was our approach to acquisitions was that we had a very strict 180-day plan. We didn't get in the face of the new acquisitions too early. We let them sort of build into the group. We took time to understand them and as a business before we did it. And one of the things I changed quite early was I said, that's great as long as I can say to the board it's nothing to do with me for the first 180 days from a cyber perspective. So if there's a breach, I can't be accountable for 180 days. And obviously that wasn't a position we could be in because we have to be accountable for that. So, very early on, we changed the approach that other than, for cyber, we would be involved straight away. We would start to talk to the business we were acquiring much earlier than we had. We significantly ratcheted up the IT due diligence that we were doing with a heavy cyber lean much earlier. So yeah, that did genuinely change how we approach that.
Gotcha. And being involved in all of those kind of in those mergers and acquisitions, those M&A processes, presumably lots of exposure to pretty senior people in Aspen, in the business that you work in.
Yeah.
When you're talking to those senior stakeholders, the executive committee, CEO, maybe the board, about cybersecurity, and maybe this is broadly, or maybe it's to do with a particular acquisition. What's your how do you approach that? What's your go-to strategy to make sure that it sticks? Obviously, there's kind of starting simple and building it up, and there's a big picture kind of laying that foundational knowledge, but in an acquisition, they're not necessarily drawn out long processes, right? It can be quite a quick kind of thing. So how do you make sure they actually get it when it comes to those kind of moments?
It's a great question, and it's something that's a real dichotomy, I think, for people that have these senior level relationships, because you have to emphasize the severity of what you're talking about, because this is really serious stuff. But at the same time, one of the things that departments like IT, like finance, etc., the relationship at the board is often you want to sort of reassure that nothing to see here, everything's fine, we're in a good place, everything's secure. So you need to sort of balance this. This is a serious and important topic, whilst providing reassurance that there's nothing to worry about. We don't need to sort of, because the last thing you want is a board spinning at the risk. You need to sort of reassure the confidence. So I always report. So one of the things that I changed, we moved our SOC. We have a fully managed SOC, and we moved to a new provider. And one of the things that we emphasised when we moved was the level of reporting. So my board reports every month will always start with the number of security events that we've tracked over the previous month. Now that's always a big number, because the events that we track are everything from someone attempting their password, so you think how many of those we have a day, right the way through to someone clicking a nefarious email link or whatever it may be. So we track 150, 180 million events, 180 million events a month. Now, obviously, that's a huge number. But what we then are able to say, but don't worry, because of those, only 50 required further investigation, and of those, 49 were informational only, and we're so big number, but we're in a really good place, and that's sort of.
That's kind of providing a bit of context then around kind
Yeah.
of where you're trying to, like you say, balance that kind of importance and emotion, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we also, when we moved our SOC, we also moved our security stack. So we moved to it was a very conscious decision to move to the Microsoft product suite. And one of the reasons for that was in the context of M&A. So the size of businesses that we often purchase are sort of small to mid-sized businesses, and we were seeing a lot more of those were starting to come to market using the Microsoft suite as well, because it's rolled into 365, it's rolled into various office plans and things. So we wanted, one of the things that we tried to do again around the M&A was to integrate these businesses much quicker. So now what we're able to do is, because we've moved to Microsoft and they're using Microsoft products, we consume that data far quicker into our SIEM through the SOC. So what it means when we go back to the board, to bring it back to question, what we're able to do is say, look, last month we had this many events. We've now onboarded these guys into our security event, into our security environment, and we've seen this increase, this decrease. So we can very quickly reassure that not only have we bought them successfully, and we've done a good set of due diligence, but actually they're in our reporting tools. And we've either seen a big or otherwise increase in numbers, and we can say of the new events how many were related. We get real insight much earlier, and that reassures. So it's all about providing that reassurance. And I think what that also does is, if you're able to provide, and don't get me wrong, we're in a fortunate position that we are pretty good most months we haven't had we had one issue that turned out to be a false positive. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, very much so. But because we can provide that, what that then means as well is, when you have something you need to talk about, a concern, a risk or something, you really get that engagement, and they listen. So it is really, but I use the phrase, the old adage, don't cry wolf. We shouldn't be ramping up the drama because you need some more money to go after this latest tool. It's about, this is where we are, very unemotional. This is where we are. This is the size of the thing. This is the risk. This is how we're going to tackle it. These are things that could happen, but you don't sort of really go too far into it. One of the other sort of stories, when you're teaching a child to cross the road, you don't spend 20 minutes explaining all the ways they could get run over, right? There's a risk you might, but here's all the ways that we're going to protect you from that. You don't list every possible vehicle that might squash you and quite how painful that would be. So I think when I take that stuff to the board, you have to contextualize it. And the final point I would say as well, the two most important questions, and I challenge myself with this all the time. I challenge my team all the time with it. They get thoroughly bored of me asking a why and so what. And I find, if you go into, when you're positioning to go to the board, when you're talking about that, if you can look back at how you've positioned your messaging, and there's space for a question of why, or there's a question of, probably worse, so what, you haven't landed your message, because there shouldn't be space for so what. We should understand the context of what you're doing. So
I think that is some super valuable advice for people, because I see that quite a lot where, I've been working with senior teams or kind of in my own kind of non-exec roles. A lot of the question that I ask is that why? And as you say, that's to probe and kind of understand a bit more about some of the context behind things, and that's natural. And there are sometimes you find yourself asking the so what, but it is usually because you're kind of like, why have you been telling me this?
Yes, exactly.
So making sure that you've kind of, I guess, kind of, there's a sense there in it, get your team and red team your presentation almost, right? Of what
absolutely, absolutely. A great example.
How would they poke holes in kind of what you're about to say, and where do you need to kind of go back and revisit and kind of make sure that you've updated things? Because often they're not. I'm interested in your thoughts here, but in my experience, they're never major things. It's not like massive clangers that people have forgotten. It's just that there was one piece of information that really draws those two things together, or that makes the whole thing kind of suddenly make sense. That is the kind of missing piece there.
Yeah, and I think one thing that occurred to me as you were speaking as well is the what haven't I told you, because the bottom line is you can't disclose everything. But, whether it be because you're still investigating, whether you can either present all of that up front, or you can consciously hold some back. Justifiably, I don't think you're covering anything up. I think it's important to understand what haven't I told you, and am I justified why? Because if a questioning takes you down, it may be that you get asked a question that leads you into that, then you need to be confident that you understand that position. But I think it is about bringing everything that's relevant now without oversharing, because you can end up down a lot of rabbit warrens you don't necessarily, because the minute you start to doubt your information, or sort of you get probed and I'm not really sure, but that starts to then question everything else you've delivered. So I think
I think
that concept of red teaming your presentation, I think, is absolutely brilliant.
I think relevance and scope is quite important. Is like, what do they want to hear? And as you said, like, there may be things that is not appropriate and you're going to exclude, and that's fine. It's not appropriate yet, and it may not be in the context of the conversation. If you're being asked to advise on a particular acquisition, for example, and what the cyber risk is there, you're not going to go and draw in a load of things from somewhere else unnecessarily. But yeah, I think, like you say, understanding why is that not what we're talking about, or why did it not make the agenda, is quite an important kind of thing to have. And as is, I think, being able to turn around and say, that's a great question, and I'd love to get some of the, properly pull the answer together and bring it together. I think sometimes people get themselves in a bit of hot water where they try to answer something they're not prepared to answer, which is what you were saying there about kind of making sure you've got that prep, making sure you've done that kind of upfront work.
Absolutely,
kind of ending up going down that rabbit hole and kind of floundering, trying to give a half-baked answer that undermines the rest of what your credibility and the rest of what you've been trying to say.
One final thing, just which I imagine people listening will say, well, obviously you'd do that, Larry. But the other thing is just make sure you understand the characters of the board members. So, we work in private equity. We have a very sort of innovative, sort of inspirational CEO who is less, fairly understandably, keen on the detail. But we have other members of the board who, being a private equity house, are very, very keen on some very, very minute detail. So being able to deliver the message that you need to deliver that satisfies your entire audience is always a challenge, but more so when you're at that level of an organization dealing with issues that are as serious and as complex as cyber can be. It's really important that you understand that. And that's where the why, so what, and what haven't I told you are really my go-to three things I sort of surround myself with when preparing that update.
Yeah, that's great. So, so you talk then about different audiences, and sometimes those are within the same room, and sometimes they are kind of at different points and times. It could be execs, employees, regulators. Like you say, you need to craft a slightly different narrative, perhaps different whys and different so whats and things like that resonates. Is it that kind of why, so what, and kind of and why not, to kind of round it out as those three? Is that how you go about crafting those different narratives, or any other kind of tools or ways that you kind of approach that?
Yeah, so one of the big communication events that sort of really stick in my mind was back in 2020 with COVID. I was working for a much smaller business. We're a family business. We had about 50 people, and we were right in, it was when COVID was all kicking off. People really unsure, what are we going to do? And I ended up with the responsibility of sort of planning and delivering our response to COVID and how we were going to manage and things like that. And it was very lucky it was a much smaller audience, but I was talking on a friend's podcast a couple of years ago about this, about how you communicate. And I approached it from, rather than having one audience of 50, I looked at it as 50 audiences of one. Because COVID was a hugely emotional time, and the way it was, completely unprecedented, which quite often major cyber events are as well. And whilst I'm not suggesting that I went away and crafted 50 individual messages, obviously that wouldn't be reasonable. But what I did try and do, and it worked so well, and sort of as a concept in my head sort of resonated so strongly, I try and do that now. And I sort of think, how how small a group can I get to be realistically, and think about how they're going to receive this news. So best example, two ends of the spectrum, the partners of our PE house ownership and the chap who drives the forklift in the warehouse here, two very, very different ends of our spectrum that we have to think about how we communicate to. And I think the big thing for me is there may be some different so whats and whys, but the core of your message has to be consistent, because the second it isn't, whilst those two groups may never cross, if you consider marketing and finance as two fairly materially different groups of people, quite often they will meet at the coffee machine, they will meet in the car park, they may well be friends. They will have a conversation about the incident that's going on, or the issue that you're trying to evolve. And if they've got a fundamentally different message, you just create confusion and ultimately potentially chaos. So for me, I'll think about how can I get it as close to the individuals I'm talking to as possible. Think about what's really important in their lives, in their world. And whilst you might change the intro and the outro, the main message has to be consistent. And I think that's vitally important, particularly for stuff messages that are complex, or it gets more and more important. And cyber, where you want a similar, quite often a similar, if not identical behavior, but for very, very different groups. So, the fact that I want our CEO to be careful about the emails he opens, as well as the occasional ones that we share with the warehouse team, or some of the other groups in the business. The core message has to be consistent and the same, so that you're always delivering that kind of elevator pitch, whatever sort of analogy you use. The core of your message has to be the same. And
so kind of getting to that kind of tweaking and tailoring that message to the right audience, rather than, like you say, it would obviously be hugely confusing if you were sticking with your finance and marketing examples. One of them, click on all the links you like, and the other one, don't click on any links, to use a super trivial kind of and kind of slightly perverse kind of extreme example, if you like. But
and a good way of managing
particularly important. Sorry, is that particularly important when it comes to like where you're? I guess a lot of what you're communicating is because you want to drive some kind of action or some kind of change as a result of it, right? You're not just saying it for no reason.
No, exactly, which is the why and so what. So yeah, a great example, again, may seem slightly trivial and blindingly obvious, but making it resonate in their world. So to maintain our relationship with finance and marketing, as we were, it may be that you're saying, just be really careful of weaponized document links. So, for example, your message to marketing is about PDF, Adobe Sign, stuff like that. When you talk to the finance guys, it's about files with macros. So it's the same principle. What I'm saying is, be careful about the content. Don't click on anything you're not sure of, etc. But you bring it to life in their world, and that's kind of how, as I said, a grossly simplified example. But it's about the intro and outro. That the little bit that brings it to life in your world is the bit you change, but the core has to be consistent.
And I suppose some of that is also more powerful if you can bring it back to, as you were kind of alluding to there, things that are relevant to their world. So if marketing are commissioning lots of different smaller people to do different marketing activities and kind of freelancers and things, the kind of e-sign things more likely to come across their desk, the kind of fraudulent invoices, dodgy attachments, things more likely to go into a finance team. So like I say, core message is the same, but then kind of tailored there. Taking a bit of a pivot, because I think there's some really amazing tips there for how to succeed, and not wanting to you've obviously, a lot of that has come from experience, I suspect. Trial and error as well. So is there anything that kind of where you've tried to explain something, it's just kind of completely fell flat? And kind of what did you learn from that, where you kind of you were kind of like, right, Larry, got this all sorted, let's go in and have this conversation, and then you're kind of on the way out scratching your head going,
what just happened?
What?
The list, I mean, I'm self-aware enough to recognise the list of things that have failed versus the list of things that have gone well is probably disproportionately longer. I'm certainly hoping this video isn't one of those things, but no, I think absolutely, 100%. Earlier in my career, frequently, and now even now, it's something I'm very, very cognizant of, because as possibly you and some of the viewers may have spotted, I can sort of ramble off a little bit occasionally, and I think for me that is a big deal. I mentioned it earlier actually about the rabbit warrens. You don't want to fall down. It's really important that when you're sort of refining that message, that you recognize the topics to stay clear of, because the worst thing you can sort of do is you mention something in passing, and of course that might happen, and then move on, and someone's like, hang on a second, what might happen, what take me through that bit, and suddenly you're in a world of pain where it could be a topic that you're not familiar, you're not entirely not fully au fait with, that you haven't had a chance to investigate yet, all of those things. So yeah, I've had plenty of examples, but when they go wrong,
that for the avoidance of doubt, I think is natural, right? And actually, the thing that I would take from that, and you mentioned self-awareness there, I think that's probably super important, and it's a really difficult thing, I suspect, to kind of. It's not the kind of thing that you can necessarily go on a training course or something like that to learn in the way that there are technical aspects and things that you can learn. But I think that has got to be an important part of something to learn, is kind of that reflection, and then, okay, well, did that work? Did I, and I think, as you were saying, was that lack of preparation on my part? Was it kind of like I got drawn into something that I didn't want to talk about, and wasn't, or well, not that I didn't want to talk about, but I wasn't ready to talk about. And so I think that kind of level of self-awareness is a really mature kind of part of it. And I think that's really important as you kind of progress your career and take on more kind of executive and kind of non-executive responsibility as well, right? Is that kind of awareness.
I think it's what, so you sort of talked about, is there a training course? The immediate answer is no. Having said that, I have to say that the prep we went through when I joined Gemini, their consulting skills workshop training you do is excellent at preparing you for some of these things. But the reality is, no, it is brutal. You will come out of a meeting normally with someone quite senior that you think you've done a quite good job at, and you come out and you think, what the hell just happened? It's horrendous. And what you can learn, the thing you can learn is not necessarily the self-awareness to sort of do it almost naturally, but sit yourself down and say, okay, and force yourself to sit in their shoes. It's very, very easy to come out of a meeting, and I've heard people say it, people on my team, people I work with in many, many organizations, as you said, it's a very natural thing to do. They say, well, they weren't listening, or they just didn't get it, or they refused to understand what I was talking about. I've even heard someone say they refused to understand what I'm talking about. That's nonsense. No one's refusing to understand. They didn't understand because you didn't position it in a way. And that's the hard bit, is to sit down and force yourself to say, what do I need to do differently to help them understand me, to help them listen? If they're not engaged, it's because you're not engaging them. It's a brutal lesson, but you have to be brutal with yourself, I think.
Is that something where also in that journey of kind of starting more simply and building up, is that something where, take the time to ask at the end, have you got it? Have you understood? And kind of learn from that. And you kind of do that explicitly as part of, if I've got to talk about this, I'm going to spend 8 minutes doing this and 2 minutes at the end asking for feedback on it. Is that kind of how you might approach it there? Or kind of maybe it's after the fact, one-to-one, seeking a bit of input on that?
I think there's again, that sort of comes back to knowing your audience, planning for your audience. You don't necessarily want to be asking the exec chairman or the non-exec chairman, can you give me, have you got that? because that might put you in a difficult position. But I think what's really important is coaching, and not necessarily anything sort of massively dramatic like mentoring, although that's obviously a very, very powerful tool. I will go and pick, if I know I'm presenting to a section of the board, for example, I will speak to one of my peers and say, okay, this is how I'm positioning it. What do you think? Get some sort of peer review ahead of time, and that is one way of doing it. But then if you do have a particularly brutal session, follow up with maybe somebody outside of the room who you do have a better relationship with, and say, buy them a coffee, say, what did I do wrong? Be brutal, but you have to be open to, and it's a difficult thing to do, and you don't always want to do it on the day. You sometimes maybe want to come back a couple of days later, but say, what went wrong? I thought I had that absolutely nailed. And I had a situation where there was something that it was a solution I really felt very strongly that we needed to have, and I foolishly approached my boss in an airport lounge after a particularly tough couple of days for a bit of a catch up. How are you doing? And mentioned it in passing, and that solution was destined never to see the light of day because I never got past that first meeting. Every time we talked about it, it was kind of dismissed as not something he wanted to do because I wasn't able to. He had very sharp guy had 3 or 4 immediate questions that I couldn't answer, and so it then became this sort of this stigma that we were never going to get past that. So I think it's when it's gone wrong, having the confidence in yourself to go and find someone friendly. Don't go to the worst person. Find someone friendly and say, what do you think went wrong? And get their opinion. It won't be the only thing. There'll be, if there are 4 or 5 people in the room, there'll be 4 or 5 reasons it didn't land. But you can start to build up and start to address that. And listen, I'm not preaching. I still get this wrong. I think we all do. We can get caught up in sort of situations, emotions, passions, whatever it is. It's something you really believe in. You don't prepare as well because you sort of almost that drive. It's got to be the right thing to do. That's enough. That will get me over the line, and it just isn't. You need to be really structured about it.
Gotcha. And just thinking about that kind of structure and kind of how you approach that. How do you? Well, I suppose do you? But if the answer is yes, how do you use kind of? I suspect the answer is yes. How do you, because you've already talked about it a little bit, but data and visuals in kind of how you approach storytelling, and is there one kind of tool or technique that you found really kind of helps to kind of land messages?
So I have a pack of whiteboard pens in my laptop bag at all times. I draw continuously, and I just find it an easier way of summing up, positioning technical issues. I would always draw things through. I've got 2 or 3 whiteboards in my office. I think one's bigger than the one we've got in the boardroom. So I just draw. I take in complicated stuff much more effectively as pictures. Now everybody learns differently, but I would argue there's more people that will understand a picture than a massively complicated table of numbers, for example. Some people, however, love numbers, but they'll still understand a picture, whereas the other way doesn't necessarily work as well. So I tend to draw everything.
1,000 words, as they say, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really do think that works. And I often find that the most compelling, I remember when I was at CAP, I was working with in one of the utilities, and we sat down with one of the customer services directors, and we were talking about replacing some of their telephony platform. And I was fairly new in my career at CAP. I was very new on the account, and the impetuousness of youth, I didn't really think it through. I sort of said, we were talking through a concept, and he was struggling, and I said, can I just use your whiteboard? And I drew it, and he said, I've learned more in the last 20 minutes than I've learned from my previous 2 providers for a year. And it's because I drew out what we were talking about and didn't do anything special. And I'm not a great artist, but just sort of talked it through. So I draw a lot. When you try and do that live in a meeting, it can be challenging, particularly nowadays with Teams and things like, lots of virtual meetings. You've got to be seriously confident in the tech that it's going to work, and if you try and do live whiteboard scribing. So I've not really done that, but I do. There's a tool I use called Miro or Miro. I don't know the best way to pronounce it. It's often used for sort of wireframe diagrams and stuff. But it's kind of this infinite whiteboard, and I quite often draw things on there and sort of move people around as we talk about that. But yeah, so I draw a lot of images. I find you don't have to be a great artist to simplify your message in a structure. A couple of other things. You talked about data.
Sorry, Larry, just quickly there, because I think drawback. I suspect there's probably a bit there within it, which was you were equating the act of drawing to help structure what you were trying to communicate, and I suspect that is probably would you mind kind of going back over that? I suspect that is part of the process of like breaking down some of that complex topic into like the act of drawing forces you into some constraints and how you would kind of show relationships between things. It's not that you're just drawing blob, 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 but there probably is inherent in the act of drawing. These 3 things kind of all feed into this thing up here, and that's related to this bit over there. And so is that drawing also helping you to understand and frame what you're going to kind of talk people through, as well as a way of educating and communicating?
Crikey, we got deep.
I think
Yeah, I think I don't think I've ever consciously thought about that, but yeah, I mean, one of the main again, I do keep going back to examples with Capgemini, but certainly one that really stuck, that landed really well. Again, a different utility this time. We were talking about sort of how things hung together, and I said, look, let's go read about. And I just drew one box, and I said, right, this is you guys, right? This is this water company. Happen to be a water company. This is the water company. Then I moved across and I said, right, you've got four bits. You've got your telephony system, your CTI system, and went through the. And each time I likened it to whether you liken it to stacked Russian dolls, or I always say, here's a box, and I lift the lid on the box, and I've got these other four boxes, and each time we lift the lid on each one and find out what's in, and drill down each time, and that sort of relaxes me, gets my head straight, and I understand. So yeah, I think it gives me the structure, but people can see the progression then as well. And that's and you're right. It's the same way, when PowerPoint was in its heyday and you had all these animations and builds and all these things. There is a place for that, because if you're explaining something complex, you need to take someone along the journey to understand. I talked about layering up. If you're taking people through the layers, I think there is a role for that sort of thing. And one of the things that drawing allows me to do in that way is you can, like you say, control that, because you're not doing the big reveal. You're not revealing stuff too early, and people are looking at it saying, "What's that over there?" Because you haven't drawn it yet. So you're sort of taking along on that journey. So it does force that structure. So I think that there is an element of that. In terms of using data, very quickly to talk about that again, I'm not massively confident with numbers. So if we're using data to pick stuff up, I have to know it inside out, and I will use only what's relevant. And I sort of come back to the board report with the cyber events. We very much provide that data for a context. So this is how big this thing is, guys. It's hundreds of millions of things a month. But what we care about are these 40, and of those 40, only this. Those numbers really support that data. So I think, as I said, I'm because I'm not hugely confident in that space, I won't put up huge amounts of analysis. When we talked about getting a managed SOC in here, sorry, one time I have used
Do
that.
you think that is like people might view that as being a weakness, but do you think it's actually a strength? Do you think the kind of some of that hesitation kind of forces you to really think about what you want to talk about, and like in some ways lots of you see it in all sorts of cybersecurity, but not just cyber, but any tool, there's dashboards and widgets and numbers and reporting and this and that and the other, and that it's almost kind of there's more and more data nowadays. It's really easy to pull together loads of stuff and kind of put it on a page. But do you think that is actually a bit of a hidden superpower, that kind of editorial stance on what's important and what isn't? Or
I'll take it, and I'd like you to do my marketing from now on. No, I think yeah, I think it may be, because it forces you to move, and you actually talked about it there. There is tons of data out there. We've got data coming out of everything, right? So, but the question is, how much of that is information? How much of that is actually useful, used, actionable? You've got to do a lot of work in a lot of cases to get that data to be really, really useful. And that's kind of the part that, it's almost the sort of double-edged sword to our 150 million events that we're looking at. 99% of those things are people entering their password every morning. We're still tracking it though. It's still important that it's right, and it's still important that we're measuring these things. So I think, yeah, it does force me to only use the stuff, A, that I'm confident in, and B, that is definitely useful. And it's a way that I talked earlier about staying out of rabbit holes. That's another way that I do it, because the chances are, particularly if I'm presenting to the board, that the characters on the board, that their background, their knowledge, their capability, they will pull me apart on numbers if I can't absolutely, without doubt, be able to show a direct line between a set of them. If I can't explain the relationships 100%, everything else will fall down around it, because then your credibility disappears when you start to I don't really know, I'm not sure where that number's come from. Well, why should we believe anything if you presented that number and not know where it's come from? How do I know the other stuff that you've talked very confidently about you actually know where it's come from? So yeah, I guess I'll take it as a superpower, definitely, but it does force me to think a lot about the numbers that I quote, for sure.
yeah, gotcha.
For sure.
Gotcha. And any other kind of advice you'd give to a CISO or an aspiring CISO, head of cybersecurity, who wants to become a better storyteller, and maybe doesn't know where to start. And preempting that by, I'm sure you're a very modest guy, Larry, but I think we've established that maybe that a bit about this and kind of where you're coming from. So any other kind of tips about delivering those sorts of things?
I think that the biggest thing for me that I learned very, very early in my career is you have to listen before you can present. You need to listen, whether that be active listening to what's going on in the room. And when you get better at so you can sort of adapt on the fly potentially based on stuff that's gone on, or it's just understand, listening in the sense that you understand the room that you're going into, stakeholder management, prepping, understanding who's there, what they like. It can be difficult if it's the first time you've ever presented those people and actually you've not come across them. My first board meeting, there were several people in the room that I'd never met before at all. And in that case, keep your message incredibly simple and be 100% confident in delivering it. You can always add more in the future. But I think that the second biggest thing, as I said, as I sort of mentioned a couple of times, I do ramble occasionally, and I've got to be that's probably my biggest weakness in presenting, is I can sort of waffle on too much, make the same point several times in the same conversation, and I need to be aware of that. So you need to build your self-awareness, build your listening. But for me, the three biggest things, most important things: so what, and why, and what haven't I told you. If you've got those things, if you can, as I said, if you can replay your message and think, what could they possibly ask me around those three things? And you won't always get all of them. Of course you won't. We're only human, and you can over prep. But I think if you've got a real conscious understanding of that, you haven't got any massive obvious so whats and whys, then you'll be in a good place. And that's that's actionable. I think that's something that you can literally go away and do straight away.
I think that's really, really sound advice. And the one thing that I would add on that, because I see sometimes people doing it, is like, if you do a really good job of all those whys and you still get asked a why or a so what, that doesn't mean that all that other work was bad. What it meant was that if you get asked something that you haven't, inherently it's going to be about the thing that you didn't think of or that you didn't prepare.
Yeah.
Right? And the fact that it's that, not the other 3 or 4 things that you had gone over and addressed, means that you did a good job in that. So building that
your prep work,
going back afterwards, you're like, well, we really did, point A, B, and C, and it wasn't until D that actually, so that was a really good result for us. Because I think sometimes people go, oh, but they still ask me about D, and it's like, but you didn't get asked about A, B, and C, so that was a good. Was a really good
start. Absolutely. You got one question instead of 5 because you preempted the other 4. So and next time, and the kind of the self-reflect, forcing yourself to do the often painful, I won't shy away from it, the often painful process of going back round even good stuff. Why did that one work when I've presented that sort of thing to 2 other people and they didn't get it, but it did work this time? Was it simply down to the audience were more receptive to that model, therefore I need to think about how I balance it for audiences who are just forcing yourself to review what you've done as well at the end of it. So that closed loop, first with yourself and then ideally with peers or friendly members of the audience, maybe a couple of days later, is definitely of value.
I think a lot of cybersecurity is built around cycles and talking about continual improvement, and good to apply that to your own yourself professionally as well.
If you do a big project, you do a post-implementation review, right? It's the same process. You do that because it's valuable and important to progress. So do it every time you present to begin with, and it will rapidly get better.
Wonderful. Larry, thank you ever so much for that. I think you sharing how you bring that kind of clarity to complexity, and I think really actionable, kind of the why, so what, and kind of what not am I talking about. Earning trust through storytelling, building those up gradually, starting simple, understanding your audience. The kind of 50 audiences of one for a larger town hall, but maybe it's 10 audiences of one, in the context of a board, and kind of, I think, putting yourself in their shoes and really applying some empathy are all really valuable things that people can take away into their kind of conversation.
Hopefully.
And growth. So a big thank you to you for sharing that. That's it for this episode of Communicating Cyber. If this has sparked an idea, challenged your thinking, gave you some practical takeaways, please subscribe, share this with your friends and colleagues, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks again to Larry ever so much for his time this morning. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment or get in touch on LinkedIn. Until next time, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.